So I think this discussion daring women in two different parts, because frankly, we're all daring women, especially in these days. Um, I'm Alicia Crank. I founded Edmonds International Women's Day way back in 2019. And it's so heartening to see that it's still going on and growing and seeing new faces in the room and also returning faces every year, because that means we're doing something right. So thank you all for being here today. As you probably know, the International Women's Day theme this year is Accelerating Action. And this was the first time I didn't have to plan it. So I slept the best I've ever slept the night before Women's Day, because I had a lot of days going in my head. But I really love the theme, even though I didn't know exactly where we were going to go with it, but I'm glad that we're doing health, women's health, mental and physical. And, I also want to look at how we can unify under collective strength. And this is all going to kind of make sense as we go further into this discussion. So 2 years ago at Women's Day, a friend of mine, a local woman named Maria Montalvo, showed up and put this thing on my head. And I'm like, what the heck is this? And she was like, it's actually an International Women's Day tradition in other parts of the world. And I was like, I had no idea. Right, and it was fresh flowers. She went to field. It was beautiful. And thankfully, I had on the right type of wig to wear it. But it sparked another thought for me, which is I think, especially in the United States, we treat Women's Day kind of as this, hey, let's have brunch and kiki and happy hour, which is great. But to know that in other parts of the world, it really is a call to action for women. So as I was kind of thinking about that going into this slightly planning and discussion, I got to meet the wonderful Diana, and over meals I was telling her about Women's Day, and she was telling me about all of her experiences and what she's seen through, and we'll see that later on. And so I was like, I want you to do this discussion with me. And I think it's so timely because we are at a point in our country right now where we need to accelerate action, where we're feeling a need to do it. Because foundationally as women, we're finding that there are some challenges we didn't think we would have to be challenged about anymore that has risen to the surface and rather quickly. So I thought being able to kind of have that heavier conversation a bit about what International Women's Day really means and how it's being regarded and spearheaded across other parts of this world would be a great thing for us to be able to look into. So thank you, Maria Montalvo, for putting that in. So when I do these things, I always let the guests introduce themselves, because one, I'm gonna forget something, and two, I might miss the thing that they really want to hit on. So Diana, I'm gonna toss it over to you to kind of tell people who you are.
Well, first of all, thank you, Alicia, for having me here. It's truly an honor for you to have me as a guest. I think the work you do regarding the International Women's Day and so many other things you do in the community, it's something to admire. So I'm deeply honored to be here today, and thank you everyone for being with us also. My name is Diana Oliveros. I am co-founder of Se Habla Media. And I arrived in Seattle as a diplomat, as a career diplomat, working for the Mexican consulate, which I no longer do. I'm now a business owner, and I'm originally from Mexico City. I've been living in Seattle in this area in Washington for 7 years. And yes, I mean, when we started talking, Alicia and we talked about this event, and we were discussing about the differences, how I see the International Women's Day, or how we call it 8M in Mexico, happens. It's totally different, and it was part of the cultural shock that I have to go through when I came here in Seattle. And the first time there was
an 8M was that video we first saw coming in.
Yeah, so for you to have a little bit of context around what you were seeing before, that's a flash mob. It's called El Violador Eres Tú, the rapist is you. That's a flash mob that was organized by a collective called Las Tesis in Chile in 2017. This happened in a public square, as you could see, and it was not part of an 8th of March celebration, but rather a November 25th which is the International Day for the Right to Access of a Life Without Violence for Women. And they did this performance, but it's relevant for International Women's Day because in Latin America, that performance and that song became a cultural icon of the women's and feminist movement in Latin America. And that's just one of the things that takes part into this commemoration, as we call it. We don't call it a celebration, but a commemoration.
Okay. Expound more on that.
Okay. So, right now, just a little bit of more background. Why I'm interested in these topics is that from an early age, I became aware of the differences that we as women face compared to men. When I was in school, in elementary school, high school, for some reason, the dynamic with other girls, I was in a mixed school, but the dynamic with girls tended to be a little bit hostile sometimes. So at some point I started feeling like I didn't feel safe being around other girls my age sometimes. It was some of them, it was like the Mean Girls movie, if you watched it. And then when I grew up, at some point, I worked for the UN in Mexico, and the offices there had nearly 90% of its staff were women. So when I went there and when I started working there, at some point I felt a little bit intimidated because of my previous experience. I mean, you grow up hearing that it's difficult to have a lady boss, that having these dynamics, power dynamics among women are difficult. And so when I went there, I was feeling intimidated. But that was actually a game changer for me. When I was there and after spending time working with other women in such an intense way, I found that, I mean, there are several different kinds of women. And I found my group, I found people with my similar interests, and the environment was really good. So I learned how to work with women, and I learned how to deconstruct this notion that working with other women is troublesome. I went through other life experiences that made me aware of the violence that women live, especially in Latin America. This is a very serious and this is a very sensitive topic, and it's deeply rooted in the 8M or International Women's Day celebrations. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Everything that happens during this day, it's not comfortable. It has a lot to do with the violence, like brutal violence that women suffer in Latin America, but it happens in the US as well. But somehow, through those lived experience, when the celebration of International Women's Day in Latin America started being what it is today, this was in 2017, so it's pretty recent. That was the moment where I felt like many of the experiences I've had were relatable to other women as well. And I think that's why those demonstrations and those commemorations have done to a lot of women in Latin America. I don't know if there are some pictures, but in 2017, it was in Argentina where there was a strike organized by women, lesbian women, and trans women. And that planted the seed to these kind of demonstrations all throughout Latin America. So on March 8th, every year since 2017, cities, all kind of cities, large cities, small cities in Latin America, see these huge demonstrations happening. They are not smooth, they are disruptive. They get criticism because very often, I mean, this movement is very inclusive, so it welcomes feminism from all kind of sources. And some of the groups in the feminist movement are radical. There are anarchist feminists going there, and they tend to do more violent demonstrations of their claims. So these demonstrations sometimes are very are very strongly questioned because of that. However, that is not exactly the spirit of the demonstrations. There's so much more happening around them, but of course, media often tends to focus on the riot kind part of the demonstration.
And we got this on rotation. So
Yeah.
So one of the things I was going to ask you about before you continue is like, you know, especially just the kind of the American male mentality. Sorry, dudes, if you're listening. But, you know, it's like when you talk about, oh, it's International Women's Day, someone's like, well, where's International Men's Day? And it's like, it's every other day. Right? But there was something that you shared with me in your background. Can you talk about the Grito de Independencia?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. When I worked for the Mexican consulate, one of the biggest celebrations in the year is the Independence Day. And for Mexicans, we have this very specific ritual to celebrate independence. And this commemorates the moment where Miguel Hidalgo, who is the father of independence, he was a priest back in the day, and he gathered his town, and in the middle of the night, he stood beneath the church bell.
Uh-huh.
And he gathered all the people, and he started yelling, asking people to rise against some of the current government. So every year we enact that moment. And being part of the consulate, we do that all throughout Washington State or anywhere there's Mexican consulates, and that was part of my job. So the first time I had to do it, I felt weird. Mm-hmm. Because this is a very masculine ritual. I mean, I don't see myself yelling at people. I don't see myself people asking them to rise and to grab the weapons and fight. But more than that, it was a matter of I was trying to practice at home and learning the words and yelling in a way that my voice doesn't crack. But I was also trying to find other women doing the same, so I can have an idea. I saw a lot. I mean, presidents do it every year, mayors, every single figure of authority in Mexico does this. But they are mostly men. So it was so difficult to find women doing the same in a way that I could see how could I envision myself doing that. So that's one of also the moments where I see that there is so much need for women representation across all spheres in life.
Yeah. So tell us about, you had this work as a diplomat, fancy, and then you were doing work with Univision while you're in Seattle, and now you're now doing Se Habla Media. So talk about how that came about from doing all that to being in Linwood doing this thing.
Okay, I'm gonna split that question in two. The first one is like, how was the road to it? Yeah. But then also, what's my perspective being a woman during that transition? So I worked for the consulate, and there I used to attend regular interviews in Univision, which is the major Spanish TV station, or used to be. And I used to go to the local newscast, and there I met my husband, Jaime Mendez. He used to be the co-anchor of the local newscast for 16 years. And at some point, me being a diplomat, it was time for me to move to somewhere else. It could be anywhere in the world. But Jaime and I had just married, so we need a little bit more time to adjust our lives and our career paths. I decided then to take a leave of absence for 3 years to stay in Washington and be able to conciliate our two lives. And that was perfectly planned. Then 2 weeks before my leave of absence started, we learned that Sinclair Broadcasting Group, who was the owner of the local affiliate, the local Univision affiliate, decided to shut it down for good. So we learned that by the end of the year, which was 3 months from that moment, both Jaime, my husband, and I would be unemployed. And that was frightening. But it also opened an opportunity for us. At the consulate, I used to lead the community outreach department. So my job was basically to go out on Washington State and Alaska and build relationships with community leaders and organizations serving Mexicans. And Jaime had been in journalism for the Hispanic community for a couple of decades already. So we decided to put together our expertise and put our own media outlet in Spanish. So Se Habla Media was born out of a necessity to fill that void in the need of access to information. Our motto is, if you don't know what's happening in your surroundings, that will make you even more vulnerable. So that's what we're trying to feel. That's how it happened and how the transition happened, and it's been a major career change for me. From the perspective of a woman, it's been also a big transition in a sense that during the time I was working for the consulate, I loved my job, and I got here in 2017, and I was really able to feel how I developed as a professional, as a professional woman. And sometimes I feel like, I don't know, it's not humble enough, but I think I did a good job. I was good at my work, and I had already earned my place in the Mexican and the Latinx community through my work in the consulate. So when this career change came about, it was tough. It's still sometimes tough because I passed from being the Mexican consul or the community outreach consul to being the wife.
Yeah.
Jaime is a very well-known person in the Latinx community. Everyone recognizes him. When we go out in the streets, people approaches us just to meet him. And when I was in the consulate, yeah, that's I had my own place too, and it was my professional path, it was my professional career, it was my achievements. But now that we're working together, I'm the wife, or I'm that girl sitting next to Jaime. Yeah. So that part has been tough. It's been a change in my identity, so to say. And I also have to recognize that this is to some extent, it's a new field for me. So I'm also learning a lot. I'm on a learning curve. But the transition has been a little surprising.
I would say I'm so happy that you hit on that, because part of what you just said will come into play during the second breakout. You will want to be here for that. Trust me. Trust me. Trust me. There is something that you said that I'm hoping that you can expound on here. You said the U.S. has been pioneer in the feminist movement, particularly in the first waves. There are recent currents in the U.S. promoted by women of color, but the achievements of the white women have diminished the activism in comparison to other countries. Talk about that.
That's my perspective, I have to say. And this relates to my cultural shock about International Women's Day when I came to the U.S. Yeah. When I was in Mexico, actually, the first demonstrations happened in 2017. I arrived in Seattle in 2017. So when this movement started gaining motion, I was already here. But I was still very involved with friends and organizations back in my country. So every March the 8th, I would see everything that was happening there and not being able to participate. Yeah. And so I tried to find something similar here, and I couldn't find it. It was different things. It was not the same causes. It was not the same emotion, the same feeling that I found there. Because one of the things that you find in these celebrations, it's some kind of catharsis of your experiences as a woman. And it was very difficult to find them here. So I was like, where is the feminist activism in the US? Mm-hmm. How does it look like? And I started seeing like, it's about the wage gap. It's about the lean-in movement. Of course, it's the Me Too movement, which it's very, very, very important. Yeah. But it was not the same as I was seeing there. As part of my work at the consulate, one of my duties was to take care of people who were in particularly vulnerable situations, including victims of crime. And these victims of crime were very often femicides, domestic violence, economic violence suffered by women. And I was witnessing how this was prevalent in Mexican women and in general women of color.
Yeah.
So my feeling was like, this is a problem here in the US too. This is very frequent. And I was looking at some figures, and I read that 500,000 people every year suffer from sexual abuse or sexual assault. I mean, that number, it's alarming.
It is.
And still, I don't see the activism about violence, about preventing violence, that I see in Latin America.
And I would say, when you shared that statistic with me, it really brought me back again to kind of foundationally when we started this event 7 years ago. And my lofty thought, my pure thought at the time was just, I want us to get together just for a few hours as just foundationally women. Not black women, white women, not Republican, Democrat, because those things are still going to exist, whatever. But I think we had lost that sense of we're still all women, and let's build from there. And especially with everything that's going on now, and you think about, okay, women that are being physically assaulted, you know, that impacts all of us across the board. It's not, oh, it's just those black women, or it's just those Latin women. So we can, like, for lack of a better word, reduce the way that we think about those things and just go foundationally as women, how do we do this? How do we do this work? How do we do this support? And then, of course, culturally, things will come into play as well. But again, it's like, how do we get to just being, let's start with the fact that this is impacting women and moving forward.
And that's a great point, and I'm happy you brought it up, because I was just thinking about that earlier today. And the thing is, even though there are differences in the experience of being a woman if you're a woman of color compared to as to if you were a white woman. One of the things I like about the way we commemorate IWD in Latin America is that it's deeply sorority plays a very important role in that, and it's very diverse. Yeah. So when you see these demonstrations, they are very well organized, and you have collectives from all kind of women. So you have the group of women with children. You have the group of women who decided not to have children. You have the indigenous women. You have the women with disability. You have the teachers. You have the caregivers. So everyone finds a place there. Mm-hmm. And going back to your point, Alicia, I think the most important lesson to be learned about this is sorority. I think that's what makes us relate to each other despite of our origins, ethnic background, etc.
And that's why we can't be afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations, right? You shouldn't be uncomfortable saying white women or what happened with black women, what those things are, because if we're not talking about it and addressing it, then it doesn't get resolved.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so I was thinking about another point that you perhaps, like the banning of DEI policies, for example. And I think that there are a lot of people who are like, yay, we're only thinking of it from like a race perspective, and got the shock of their lives, specifically white women, got the shock of their lives. It's like, oh wait, he's including women in this part too. And I'm like, you know, like,
exactly.
And sometimes it takes a harder lesson for people to get that point. But again, it goes back to, if we come back foundationally as women, the rest of it will start to make sense. And the activism that needs to happen will start to make a lot more sense when we don't start out with culturalizing. Mm-hmm. I just made that up, I think. Culturalizing the activism. If we start as women, okay, you're all on board. Now, are there certain avenues that each of us can take to get to the main goal? Absolutely. It should be a level of diversity even within that. But if foundationally we're saying this is what we're trying to do, you take this of what you know and your experience, go battle that thing, come back to us, let us know how we can support that, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think there's a very essential notion of partnership and alliances that need to be part of this conversation and need to be part of feminism. As you mentioned, feminism and feminist activism played a huge role in the development of DEI policies. Mm-hmm. It was part of the foundations of it. And now that you mention it, mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, DEI policies affect women.
Yeah.
and it was not necessarily evident when this was all
Right.
managed. So in the end, I think there is great value on the elements that the International Women's Day, feminism, activism brings to the table, because it's about how do we recognize our differences but manage to work, make them work out for everyone's best interest.
Yeah. One more question for you, and I'm going to take it out to you guys if you have a question. You don't have to get up. We have a very powerful microphone that'll pick you up from where you're sitting. Thanks to our friend Dan over there. Thank you, Dan. Oh, talk about some of the wins in Latin America around this level of activism.
Yes, very often these demonstrations, as I mentioned, they get a harsh criticism. And even today, when I'm talking with friends, particularly, well, not necessarily, but particularly male friends, they say, what's the use of those demonstrations? I mean, it's one day a year, what difference does it make? And the thing is, one, it's not just a day. If you look for these demonstrations, there is a whole lot of organizations leading up to these days. To this day, there have been organizations that have been born out of people getting together to participate in the demonstrations. So these demonstrations in Latin America have been fundamental to organize the civil society around the fight for the rights of women. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. The other thing is there is evidence that there has been policy changes in Latin America as a result of the activism that these demonstrations have begun. Some of these examples are, for example, in Mexico, there is a law in which they criminalize digital violence. It's called the Ley Olimpia, or Olimpia Law. Olimpia was a woman who was in a relationship. They exchanged pictures, intimate pictures, and then the partner used those pictures to blackmail her, to share them with people without her consent. So because of this case and because of this activism, it was possible to generate a law where this is considered violence and this is considered a crime. Mm. I recently learned also that in Mexico, if you want to get an driving license, an ID, or different documents, you need to provide proof that you are up to date in your child support obligations, which I think it's amazing.
Yeah. Come on, Erica, you deal on board with that.
Several countries in Latin America have legalized the right to abortion. Which is something that we're going backwards in this country. And like these, there are several other examples where changes have been made to constitutions, where laws have been written in order to expand the rights of women. The other side of the effect of these demonstrations, it's awareness. Right now, there's no one in Mexico who's not aware about what's happening during March the 8th. It's mainstream. Everyone knows and prepares for these days because there's gonna be havoc in the city because of the demonstrations. But that leads to know why is that happening. One of the things I was hearing today, and in comparison to the US, is that, for example, the Me Too movement, I find many similarities between the Me Too movement and what we do during March the 8th in Latin America. The topics are very similar. However, I was listening about a survey in young men about Me Too movement, and they are not aware what it is about. They say like, oh, it's a celebrity thing. The awareness about the importance of this movement has faded away.
Yeah.
So these demonstrations are a very powerful tool to raise awareness about the topic.
You need to do one of those around here.
Yeah.
I'm looking at some of y'all. So the last piece before I turn it over is that one of the things that she had on here too is that 9 countries in Latin America have had a woman president.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And the funny thing is when I hear that I knew it, but it's like when you see it up close and personal like that, it's like, I think about when people go, America's our first world country and we're leading the pack. I'm like, we can't even get a woman president. We're not doing something right, and maybe it starts with accelerating our action, right?
Yes. Yes.
Maybe do that.
Definitely. Sometimes, being part of these movements is not easy. It's, as I mentioned, it's not comfortable because it makes you face so many situations that you live that you didn't even realize you were subject to violence back then. And it makes you look around and see how many women share the same experiences and how frequent, how common, and how normalized is for a woman to suffer violence. And that brings me down very often. However, looking at the bright side, I mean, not everything is lost, and there is progress in Latin America in this topic. I was comparing indexes and statistics, and there is the World Economic Forum talking about the gender gap in different countries, and it evaluates political representation, educational attainment, economic opportunities, and access to health. And in terms of political representation, Latin America ranks second just after Europe. And this is what you were mentioning. In Latin America, there's been 9 countries having a woman president. The first woman president was in 1970s. It was an interim position that she was covering, but then the first elected woman was in 1990. This is 35 years ago, and it's been yeah, and many countries in Latin America are very close to an equal gender parity in their Congress. Here in the U.S., I think it's 20-something% of women are take part in the Congress. So that's exciting to see that even though we have a huge problem with violence, there are some other areas in which we are having progress and advancement. And well, the most recent case, it's the president in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. Mm-hmm. And I was also reading criticism saying that, but these women got there because they were backed by a male political leader. As was the case of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, she was also backed by Lula da Silva, who was a very strong and charismatic leader and president in Brazil, and then came Dilma Rousseff. With Claudia Sheinbaum happened something similar. We had a previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He was a very charismatic president, and he supported Claudia Sheinbaum to be his successor. So many people say, yes, she's president because she had the support of the previous president. But guess what? She got more votes than he did. Mm-hmm. She's been the most voted president in the history of Mexico. Wow. And not just that, hadn't she won, we would still have a woman president in Mexico because the second front runner was also a woman. Yeah. So don't tell me it's because they were backed by a male leader.
And there's nothing wrong with having a male to sponsor you, you know what I mean? As long as they know sponsor you, then get the heck out the way. Yeah. We'll open it up for a couple of questions before the break. So does anyone have a question? Go for it.
So as we talked about, and we all are aware of, we're behind in the United States getting this movement going. And with the current political landscape going on, we're going backwards. So what is the call to action? What can we do locally?
I think, well, first of all, awareness. It's key. I think we've seen how women's rights have been threatened and diminished in the past few years. But I think they still hit like very localized interest. Like people can be can advocate for abortion rights. Then there's another group of people advocating for wage gap elimination. But we need to realize that this is all part of the same problem. And it has the same roots. So that we can fight together, even if it's for different pieces of the cause.
So choose one area that you're passionate about that moves the
and build bridges with the other causes. Yeah,
that's a perfect segue. And I did not set her up for this question at all, but that way of thinking is why I started my new nonprofit called Northwest Washington Civic Circle, and it's to be a hub, right? It's to say, okay, we're not trying to be yet another nonprofit trying to do civic engagement. It's like, okay, we know that group over there is doing this, then that group over there is doing that. but we're trying to get the same audiences, but we're so siloed, we're only getting this
Uh-huh.
chunk here and that chunk there. So the goal of Civic Circle is say, okay, let's pool those resources together. Let's have this event jointly in a space where we can bring in more people and bring more awareness. So no, I absolutely agree with you that is one of the issues, especially up here. You know, I worked in Seattle for the past two and a half years in civic engagement, and what I saw was that, you know, it's a desert up here. Once you get past Seattle city limits, you know, not even just King County, just Seattle proper, unless it's political, there's not a lot of collective civic engagement. So that's kind of the hope I have for that new passion project, is to say what you were saying, like, hey, take that group, this group over here, let's do this together, have a larger audience, have a larger breadth of outreach to kind of get that activism going.
Yeah.
Okay. We have time for one more. Yes.
Well, in line with what you're saying, what do you recommend? We need a catalyst. Because like you said, we're silos. I belong to 2 organizations and they don't do anything together.
Yeah.
And one of my organizations, AAUW, is dying
Yeah.
for people to come to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we're very amenable to people, other groups doing things together with us.
Let's
And
talk about it.
So I think we all need to talk to other women and say, what organizations do you belong to?
Yes.
Can we come and have a joint meeting? But if other people have ideas for these catalytic forces, we definitely need to start talking to each other.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
I have some cards if you're interested.
Well, we're going to take a break. So thank you so much for this. I hope you're coming back for the second one. Even if you didn't sign up for, come back anyway. But we're going to do something I think is going to be super uplifting. That's a compliment to this, and it involves this. So see you in 15 minutes.